The Parallel Kingdom. Imagine standing on a Cretaceous beach 70 million years ago. Behind you, the ground trembles with the footfalls of a Tyrannosaurus rex, 9 tons of apex predator, the most fearsome creature to ever walk the earth. You watch as this titan approaches the water's edge to drink, and something extraordinary happens. It stops. It hesitates. The most dangerous land animal in Earth's history refuses to wade deeper than its ankles. The T-Rex isn't being cautious, it's being smart. Because while dinosaurs ruled the land with absolute dominion for over 160 million years, they never, not once, truly conquered the oceans. The seas belonged to something else entirely. Something that would have torn even the mightiest dinosaur to pieces the moment it ventured too far from shore. Welcome to the Parallel Kingdom, a world that existed alongside the Age of Dinosaurs, yet remained utterly separate from it. A realm where the rules were different, where evolution took a completely divergent path, and where creatures evolved that make even our modern great white sharks look like harmless minnows by comparison. This is the story of the marine reptiles, the ocean monsters that dinosaurs were afraid of. For 184 million years, from the early Triassic through the end of the Cretaceous, while dinosaurs dominated every terrestrial ecosystem on Earth, the oceans were ruled by an entirely different dynasty. Not fish, not sharks, but air-breathing reptiles that had abandoned the land their ancestors once walked, returning to the seas to become some of the most successful predators in evolutionary history. These weren't dinosaurs. This is crucial to understand. Despite what popular culture often suggests, marine reptiles like Mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and ichthyosaurs were no more closely related to dinosaurs than you are to your neighbor's cat. They were separate lineages. Reptiles, yes, but ones that made a choice their dinosaur cousins never dared to make. They went back into the water, all the way back. And in doing so, they became something extraordinary. The largest predators ever known. Creatures with bite forces that exceeded even the legendary Tyrannosaurus rex. Animals so perfectly adapted to oceanic life that some gave live birth in open water, never needing to return to land, even to reproduce. Hunters with senses so refined they could detect the electrical fields generated by their prey's beating hearts from dozens of feet away in complete darkness. But here's what makes their story truly fascinating. We almost never knew they existed at all. In 1811, in the coastal cliffs of Lyme Regis, England, a 12-year-old girl named Mary Anning made a discovery that would shake the scientific world to its foundations. Embedded in the ancient Jurassic rocks, she found the complete skeleton of a creature that shouldn't exist. A reptile with a body like a dolphin, jaws like a crocodile, and eyes the size of dinner plates. It was the first ichthyosaur ever found by science. The scientific establishment didn't know what to make of it. Some called it a fake. Others suggested it was a deformed crocodile. A few nervous clergymen worried it contradicted the biblical timeline of creation. But Mary Anning, daughter of a poor cabinet maker, knew exactly what she'd found. Evidence of an ancient world that existed long before humans, before mammals, before anything remotely familiar walked the earth. She would spend her life pulling these monsters from the cliffs, fossil by fossil, revealing an entire civilization of ocean predators that time had forgotten. Over the next 2 centuries, paleontologists would uncover their empire. In Kansas, they'd find mosasaurs that reached 50 feet in length, animals that could swallow a human whole without slowing down. In Norway, they'd discover plesiosaurs with necks containing more vertebrae than any living animal, serpentine hunters that could strike from impossible angles. In Nevada's ancient seabeds, they'd piece together ichthyosaurs that rivaled modern sperm whales in size, with the largest eyes ever evolved by any animal on Earth. Each discovery revealed the same shocking truth. While we've spent centuries obsessing over dinosaurs, studying their every bone and behavior, an equally magnificent dynasty existed in parallel, one that we've largely ignored. Why? Perhaps because we can't see beneath the surface. The ocean keeps its secrets well, and we're land animals. We identify with the terrestrial world. Dinosaurs walked where we walk, saw what we see. But the marine reptiles inhabited a three-dimensional realm that remains alien to us even today. 95% of Earth's oceans remain unexplored in the modern age. Imagine how much more mysterious they were in deep time. But there's another reason their story has remained in the shadows. The ocean is where the fossil record goes to die. Continental rocks preserve history. Ocean sediments? Most get subducted into the Earth's mantle, pulled down by tectonic plates and recycled into magma. For every marine reptile fossil we've found, thousands, perhaps millions of individuals lived and died without leaving a trace. What we do have are glimpses, snapshots of a world more diverse, more violent, and more successful than anything on land. Consider the timeline. Dinosaurs ruled for approximately 165 million years, from the late Triassic through the end of the Cretaceous. Impressive, certainly. But marine reptiles? They dominated the oceans for 184 million years, outlasting their terrestrial cousins by nearly 20 million years. And unlike dinosaurs, which were restricted to land and occasionally wading into shallow water, marine reptiles conquered every oceanic niche imaginable. Shallow tropical reefs, patrolled by small, agile mosasaurs that hunted like modern sea snakes. The open ocean, the domain of giant ichthyosaurs that dove to depths exceeding 3,000 feet, hunting giant squid in complete darkness. The polar seas, home to specialized plesiosaurs that thrived in near-freezing waters where dinosaurs couldn't survive. The deep ocean trenches? We're only now finding evidence that some species ventured even there. They evolved to fill every role. Some became ambush predators, lying motionless on the seafloor. Others became pursuit predators, capable of sustained speeds that would exhaust their prey. Still others became pack hunters, coordinating attacks with a sophistication that wouldn't be seen again until dolphins evolved tens of millions of years later. And the largest among them grew to sizes that make modern orcas look modest. Mosasaurus hoffmanii, the largest mosasaur species, reached lengths of at least 56 feet and weights approaching 30,000 pounds. Its skull alone was over 5 feet long, filled with rows of recurved teeth designed for one purpose: to grip prey so firmly that escape was impossible. Its bite force has been estimated at 16,000 pounds per square inch, stronger than any dinosaur, stronger than any living animal, except possibly the modern saltwater crocodile. But size tells only part of the story. What made marine reptiles truly terrifying was how they hunted. Modern sharks are efficient killers, certainly. They bite, they retreat, they wait for blood loss to weaken their prey. It's a strategy refined over 400 million years. But marine reptiles didn't have that luxury. They were air breathers. Every hunt was a calculated risk. They couldn't afford extended pursuits that would exhaust their oxygen supply. So they evolved something more effective than patience. They evolved overwhelming violence. When a large mosasaur attacked, it didn't bite and retreat. It bit and kept biting, using its flexible skull and specialized jaw joints to work prey deeper into its mouth, while its teeth, replaced continuously throughout life, shredded flesh and crushed bone. Fossilized mosasaur stomach contents have revealed entire animals swallowed whole. Turtles the size of car hoods still in their shells. Giant fish swallowed head first. Other mosasaurs, sometimes nearly as large as the predator itself. They were eating machines, processing protein with industrial efficiency. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of these creatures wasn't their size or their feeding habits. It was their intelligence. Brain endocasts, 3D reconstructions made from the internal surfaces of fossil skulls, reveal that many marine reptiles had brain-to-body mass ratios comparable to modern dolphins. Their brains show enlarged regions associated with processing visual information, coordinating complex movement, and possibly even social behavior. These weren't mindless eating machines. They were problem solvers, capable of learning, adapting, and possibly even recognizing individual members of their species. Some paleontologists go further, suggesting certain species may have exhibited play behavior, grief at the loss of offspring, and long-term pair bonding. Evidence for this remains controversial, but the anatomical foundations are there. These were sophisticated animals with rich internal lives, and they absolutely dominated their environment. So completely, in fact, that dinosaurs never managed to invade their territory. Despite millions of years of evolution, despite producing species adapted to nearly every terrestrial environment imaginable, from Arctic tundra to scorching deserts, dinosaurs never evolved a single truly oceanic species. A few ventured into rivers, some waded in shallow coastal waters, but the deep ocean? That remained forever beyond their reach. Why? The simple answer is, they couldn't compete. Every time a land reptile tried to return to the sea, it had to compete with marine reptiles that had millions of years of evolutionary refinement. The ocean wasn't empty territory waiting to be colonized. It was contested ground, held by dynasties that had already perfected the art of oceanic predation. Dinosaurs were locked out of the seas by creatures that had claimed them first. In the chapters ahead, we'll dive beneath the surface of that ancient ocean. We'll meet the dynasties one by one, the ichthyosaurs, the first to make the transition, evolving bodies so hydrodynamically perfect they've never been improved upon. The plesiosaurs, with their nightmare anatomy and hunting strategies that still confuse scientists. And finally, the mosasaurs, the last dynasty. The ones that achieved such dominance, they were still expanding their range and diversifying right up until the moment the asteroid struck. We'll explore how they hunted, how they reproduced, how they saw, how they communicated. We'll examine the evidence for their behavior. Fossil bone beds that suggest mass strandings, tooth marks that reveal cannibalism, stomach contents that tell stories of their last meals. And we'll ask the question that still haunts paleontology. If these creatures were so successful, so dominant, so perfectly adapted, why did they vanish? Why do we live in a world where whales rule the oceans, when by all rights it should still belong to the reptiles? But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to go back. Back to a time when the world was barely recognizable, when the supercontinent Pangaea was just beginning to fracture, and when the oceans were nearly empty of large predators. Back to the moment when the first reptiles stood at the water's edge and made a choice that would echo through 184 million years of evolutionary history. Back to the beginning of the conquest, the return to the sea. 250 million years ago, the world was dying. The Permian-Triassic extinction event, the Great Dying, as paleontologists call it, had just concluded. It was the most catastrophic loss of life in Earth's history, making the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs look merciful by comparison. 96% of all marine species vanished. 70% of terrestrial vertebrates went extinct. Entire ecosystems collapsed. The ocean's oxygen levels plummeted. Acid rain fell for thousands of years. Temperatures soared to levels that made equatorial regions virtually uninhabitable. The world that emerged from this apocalypse was alien, wounded, and desperately empty. Empty ecosystems are evolution's greatest opportunity. In the aftermath of the Great Dying, the ocean was a vast wilderness with almost no large predators. The ancient sharks and armored fish that had ruled the Permian seas were gone. The reefs were dead. The food chains had collapsed. But life, as it always does, found a way forward. And in that moment of global devastation, some reptiles saw opportunity where others saw only death. They went back into the water, not tentatively, not gradually, but with an evolutionary commitment so total it would reshape the entire structure of marine ecosystems for the next 184 million years. But here's what makes this fascinating. They'd done it before. The return to the sea wasn't a novel idea in reptilian evolution. Long before the marine reptiles we're discussing, other lineages had tested the waters. In the late Carboniferous, around 300 million years ago, a bizarre group called Mosasaurs, small needle-toothed reptiles, had evolved to hunt in freshwater lakes. They had flattened tails for swimming and elongated bodies, but they were evolutionary dead ends, vanishing long before the Permian extinction. The ocean had been tried before, and it had failed before. What made the post-extinction attempt different was timing, desperation, and possibly sheer luck. The early Triassic Ocean was a blank slate, and the reptiles that entered it this time weren't dabbling. They were committing to a complete transformation. Within just a few million years, a geological eye blink, multiple lineages of land reptiles independently evolved to become oceanic predators. This is crucial to understand. Marine reptiles aren't a single family tree. They're multiple separate invasions of the ocean, happening roughly simultaneously, each solving the same problems in startlingly different ways. The first to make the leap were the ichthyosaurs. Their name means fish lizard, and it's almost perfectly accurate. If you saw an ichthyosaur swimming past you underwater, your first thought wouldn't be reptile, it would be dolphin. The resemblance is so uncanny that for decades, paleontologists used ichthyosaurs as the textbook example of convergent evolution, the phenomenon where unrelated species evolve similar body plans because they face similar environmental pressures. But the ichthyosaurs took convergent evolution to an almost supernatural extreme. They didn't just resemble fish superficially. They rebuilt their entire anatomy from the ground up, transforming every major system to function in ways their terrestrial ancestors never imagined. Their limbs became flippers, but not simple paddles. Each flipper contained dozens of tightly packed bones, creating a flexible hydrofoil more sophisticated than anything modern cetaceans possess. Their spines developed a downward bend near the tail, supporting a vertical tail fluke identical in function to a shark's, despite evolving from completely different starting anatomy. Most astonishing of all, their eyes. Ichthyosaur eyes were enormous. In some species, the largest eyes ever evolved by any animal in Earth's history. The giant ichthyosaur Ophthalmosaurus, eye lizard, had eyes measuring nearly 12 inches in diameter. To put that in perspective, the largest eyes of any living animal belong to the colossal squid, at about 11 inches. But the colossal squid weighs up to 1,500 pounds and lives in the deepest parts of the ocean. Ophthalmosaurus had eyes that big in a body only 12 feet long. Why? The answer reveals something profound about how these animals lived. Modern analysis of the sclerotic rings, bony structures that supported the eyeball, shows that ichthyosaurs were deep divers. Not casual divers that ventured 100 feet down. We're talking extreme depths. Some species regularly dove below 3,000 feet into the abyssal zone, where sunlight becomes a distant memory and pressure crushes anything not specifically adapted to withstand it. At those depths, eyes are useless, unless they're massive enough to gather every available photon of light. Ichthyosaurs were hunting in near-total darkness, chasing bioluminescent prey through an alien world of pressure and cold that would kill a human instantly. Their eyes weren't just large, they were sophisticated optical instruments, with specialized structures to prevent distortion at depth and maximize light sensitivity in conditions where most animals would be functionally blind. They were seeing things we still can't see, even with modern technology. But giant eyes solve only one problem. Deep diving creates dozens more. Pressure increases by 1 atmosphere every 33 feet of depth. At 3,000 feet, the pressure is over 90 times what we experience at sea level, enough to collapse the lungs of any air-breathing animal not specifically adapted to handle it. Modern sperm whales, which dive to similar depths, have evolved collapsible rib cages that allow their lungs to compress completely, preventing nitrogen absorption that would cause the bends. They also have extraordinarily high concentrations of myoglobin in their muscles, the protein that stores oxygen, allowing them to hold their breath for over an hour. Ichthyosaurs had to solve the same problems, and they did so with such efficiency that their solutions wouldn't be matched until cetaceans evolved tens of millions of years later. Fossilized ichthyosaur soft tissue, yes, we have some, reveals muscles densely packed with myoglobin, giving them the same dark, almost black coloration seen in modern deep-diving whales. Their ribs show evidence of extreme flexibility, allowing for lung collapse. And most remarkably, analysis of their bone density suggests they had developed specialized lipids in their skeletal structure that would prevent nitrogen narcosis, the underwater equivalent of getting drunk from absorbed nitrogen gas. These weren't primitive reptiles awkwardly learning to swim. These were apex predators engineered for an environment more hostile than outer space. And they evolved this sophistication in less than 10 million years. Think about that timeline. 10 million years from the first tentative ichthyosaur wading into shallow water to species capable of diving deeper than nuclear submarines. For comparison, it took humans roughly 6 million years to evolve from our last common ancestor with chimpanzees, and we can barely hold our breath for 2 minutes. Evolution, when given empty niches and survival pressure, moves with breathtaking speed. But the ichthyosaurs weren't alone in their invasion. While they were mastering the open ocean and the deep sea, another group was taking a completely different approach to aquatic dominance. The plesiosaurs were coming. If ichthyosaurs evolved to look like fish, plesiosaurs evolved to look like nightmares. Picture this: a body like a barrel, 4 flippers instead of 2, a tail that's almost vestigial, and, most disturbing of all, a neck that in some species contained more than 70 vertebrae, making it longer than the rest of the body combined. The whole animal moved through the water like nothing before or since, using all 4 flippers in a complex underwater flight motion that still puzzles biomechanics experts. When paleontologists first discovered plesiosaur fossils in the early 1800s, they assumed they'd been assembled incorrectly. Surely no animal actually had proportions this bizarre. Surely the neck bones came from a different creature entirely. But as more specimens emerged from the rocks of England, Germany, and North America, the terrible truth became clear. Plesiosaurs really looked like this. Evolution had created something that violated every rule of sensible body design. That absurdly long neck? It wasn't decorative. It was a weapon. Modern studies of plesiosaur neck flexibility reveal they could bend their necks in ways that seem almost serpentine, striking at prey from angles that no other predator could achieve. Imagine being a fish in the Jurassic Ocean. You're watching carefully for predators approaching from the sides, from above, from below. You're using every sense evolution gave you to detect danger. And then, from a direction you weren't even monitoring, from a body length away but somehow still directly next to you, a set of interlocking teeth snaps shut on your body. The plesiosaur's neck had given it reach its body size would never suggest. It was hunting with geometry other predators couldn't access. But that's only one family of plesiosaurs, the long-necked variety, called plesiosauroids. Their cousins, the pliosauroids, went in exactly the opposite direction. Pliosauroids had short necks, massive heads, and body plans built entirely around overwhelming power. These were the ocean's equivalent of Tyrannosaurus rex, but they evolved 80 million years earlier and lived in an environment where prey couldn't simply be chased down. Everything happened in 3 dimensions, with predator and prey maneuvering in ways that would be impossible on land. The largest pliosauroids reached lengths of 40 feet or more. Predator X, discovered in Norway and properly named Plesiosaurus funki, had a skull over 6 feet long, a full third of its body length. Its bite force has been estimated at 33,000 pounds per square inch, making it possibly the most powerful bite of any animal ever measured, living or extinct. That's 4 times the bite force of a T-Rex, nearly 16 times the bite force of a modern great white shark. When Predator X bit down on prey, it wasn't attempting to wound or weaken. It was attempting to immediately destroy. Fossilized plesiosaur bones have been found with pliosauroid tooth marks, that go completely through the bone, shattering it. These weren't surgical strikes, they were demolition. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. Plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs weren't just coexisting in the ocean. They were competing, hunting each other, and occasionally eating each other. We know this because of trace fossils, the marks left behind by ancient behavior. In 2014, paleontologists described a Jurassic ichthyosaur specimen from England that showed evidence of a plesiosaur bite to its flipper. The ichthyosaur survived. The bones had partially healed, but the tooth marks matched perfectly to a contemporary plesiosaur species. In Germany, another ichthyosaur specimen was found with a plesiosaur tooth embedded in its vertebra. And in Nevada, a large pliosauroid skeleton was discovered with ichthyosaur bones in its stomach region. The ocean was a war zone, with different dynasties of marine reptiles competing for the same resources, the same hunting grounds, the same prey. And unlike terrestrial ecosystems, where predators can establish territories and avoid each other, the three-dimensional nature of the ocean meant encounters were inevitable. Everything was eating everything else. But both ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs faced a challenge that would define their entire evolutionary trajectory. They were air breathers in an underwater world. Every dive was temporary. Every hunt was a race against oxygen depletion. And most critically, they had to return to the surface to breathe, making them vulnerable in ways that fish and sharks never were. This single constraint, the need to breathe air, shaped everything about their biology. It meant they couldn't afford to be ambush predators that waited motionlessly for days. They had to be active hunters, constantly moving, constantly burning energy. It meant their hunting strategies had to be decisive. Long pursuits would exhaust their oxygen reserves. And it meant they had to be extraordinarily efficient with every breath, extracting every molecule of oxygen they could before diving again. Evolution's answer was myoglobin, those specialized oxygen storage proteins we mentioned earlier. But there's a cost to high myoglobin concentrations. It makes blood viscous, thick, almost syrupy. To pump this heavy blood through their bodies efficiently, marine reptiles needed massive hearts and elevated metabolisms. This is where the debate gets fascinating and controversial. Were marine reptiles warm-blooded? For decades, the assumption was no. Reptiles are cold-blooded. Therefore, marine reptiles must have been cold-blooded. Simple. Except nothing about these animals was simple. Modern analysis of growth rings in ichthyosaur bones suggests growth rates comparable to modern dolphins, far faster than any living reptile. Isotope analysis of their teeth indicates body temperatures consistently higher than the surrounding water, even in polar regions. And biomechanical modeling of their swimming suggests metabolic rates that simply couldn't be sustained by a cold-blooded animal. The evidence increasingly suggests that at least some marine reptiles, particularly the larger deep-diving species, had evolved some form of endothermy. Not quite mammalian warm-bloodedness, but something in between. Perhaps regional endothermy, keeping certain body parts warm while allowing others to cool. Or perhaps gigantothermy, using their massive size to retain heat like modern leatherback turtles. Whatever the mechanism, they weren't behaving like modern reptiles. They were too active, too widespread, too successful in too many different environments. They were something new, something that didn't fit neatly into our categories of warm-blooded or cold-blooded. They were marine reptiles, and they operated by rules we're still trying to understand. By the end of the Triassic period, roughly 200 million years ago, both ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs had established themselves as the dominant predators of the ocean. They'd spread across every sea, adapted to every depth, conquered every niche from tropical reefs to polar waters. The invasion was complete. The ocean belonged to the reptiles, and they would hold it, unchallenged by any land animal, for the next 135 million years. But their empire wasn't finished growing. It hadn't even reached its peak, because in the Cretaceous period, 100 million years ago, a third dynasty would emerge, one that made ichthyosaurs look graceful and plesiosaurs look subtle. A lineage that would grow so large, so dominant, and so terrifying that they would push the other marine reptiles to the edge of extinction through sheer competitive pressure. The Mosasaurs were about to enter the story, and when they did, the ocean would never be the same. The last dynasty. 100 million years ago, something was stirring in the shallow coastal waters of the Cretaceous world. The ichthyosaurs, those perfectly streamlined masters of the deep, were declining. Not catastrophically, not yet, but their diversity was shrinking. Where once dozens of species had occupied every oceanic niche imaginable, now only a handful remained, concentrated mostly in deep-water environments where competition was less fierce. The plesiosaurs still thrived, their bizarre body plans as successful as ever, but even they were beginning to feel pressure from an unexpected direction. The competition wasn't coming from the open ocean, it was coming from the shore. In the warm, shallow seas that covered much of what is now Europe, North America, and the Middle East, a group of semi-aquatic lizards had begun hunting in the water. They were ichthyosaurs, modest creatures, rarely exceeding 6 feet in length, with slightly flattened tails and webbed feet. They looked like modern monitor lizards that had decided to supplement their diet with fish and squid. They were unremarkable, forgettable even, and they were about to inherit the ocean. Within just 20 million years, a geological instant, these unprepossessing coastal lizards would evolve into the largest, most powerful marine predators the world had ever seen. They would grow to lengths exceeding 50 feet. They would develop bite forces that surpassed even the great pliosauroids. And they would dominate the Cretaceous seas so completely that by the end of their reign, they would be virtually the only large marine reptiles left. Welcome to the age of the Mosasaurs. The name comes from the Meuse River in the Netherlands, where the first specimen was discovered in 1764, decades before anyone had even conceived of the idea of extinction, let alone dinosaurs. Quarry workers in a limestone mine near Maastricht found a massive skull embedded in the rock, jaws bristling with teeth, each one curved backward like a scimitar. The local scientific establishment claimed it immediately, recognizing that this was something significant, even if they had no framework to understand what it actually was. Some thought it was a whale. Others suggested a crocodile of unusual size. A few whispered it might be a dragon. They were all wrong. It was something that had no modern equivalent. The specimen sat in a private collection for years, surviving the French Revolution. There's a wonderful story about Napoleon's troops specifically seeking it out during their invasion of the Netherlands, and eventually landing in the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, where it remains today. Georges Cuvier, the father of paleontology, studied it extensively and declared it to be an extinct marine reptile, closely related to modern monitor lizards. He was right. But even Cuvier couldn't have imagined just how spectacular these animals truly were. Because that first specimen, Mosasaurus hoffmanni, now the official type species, was just the beginning. As paleontologists began looking specifically for mosasaur fossils, they found them everywhere. In Kansas, where an ancient seaway had once split North America in two. In Morocco, where Cretaceous phosphate deposits preserved stunning specimens. In New Zealand, in Japan, in Angola, in Antarctica. Mosasaurs had conquered the world's oceans more thoroughly than any marine reptile before them. And they did it with a body plan that, by all rights, shouldn't have worked. Look at an ichthyosaur and you see a creature perfectly engineered for aquatic life. Streamlined, hydrodynamic, every feature refined by millions of years of evolution. Now look at a mosasaur. It's lumpy. The body is almost barrel-shaped in cross-section. The tail has a distinct downward bend, exactly like an ichthyosaur's, but it's not quite as elegant. The flippers are clearly modified limbs, not the specialized hydrofoils ichthyosaurs had evolved. A mosasaur looks like someone took a monitor lizard, stretched it to 50 feet, added flippers, and expected it to compete with animals that had been perfecting oceanic predation for over 100 million years. Somehow, it worked better than anything that came before. The secret was in the skull. Mosasaur skulls are masterpieces of predatory engineering. Mobile, flexible, and built to deliver catastrophic damage to prey. Unlike the rigid skulls of ichthyosaurs or the crushing skulls of plesiosaurs, mosasaur skulls could flex and expand, allowing them to manipulate prey with shocking sophistication. They had extra joints in their lower jaws, a feature called a mandibular hinge that allowed the jaw to bow outward in the middle, widening the gape even further. They had specialized skull joints that let the whole skull expand laterally, similar to modern snakes. And most remarkably, they had pterygoid teeth, extra rows of teeth on the roof of the mouth that pointed backward, creating a ratcheting system that would walk prey deeper into the throat with every swallowing motion. When a mosasaur grabbed prey, escape wasn't just difficult. It was mechanically impossible. Every movement the prey made to struggle would only drive it deeper into the mosasaur's gullet, the backward curved teeth ensuring that forward motion was easy, while backward motion was prevented absolutely. It was a biological version of those finger traps. The harder you fought, the more trapped you became. And if the prey was too large to swallow whole, mosasaurs had an answer for that, too. Fossilized mosasaur stomach contents show evidence of partial digestion. Animals that were bitten multiple times, chunks removed, and then processed piece by piece. Unlike modern sharks, which bite and retreat, mosasaurs appear to have engaged in sustained feeding, using those flexible jaws to tear away manageable pieces from prey too large to consume in one go. They were processing animals like machinery processes raw materials, efficiently, thoroughly, and without mercy. But here's what makes mosasaurs truly remarkable from an evolutionary standpoint. They did all this while remaining fundamentally lizard-like in their basic anatomy. Ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs had departed so completely from their terrestrial ancestors that trying to trace their lineage was like archaeological guesswork. But mosasaurs? You can look at a mosasaur skeleton and still see the monitor lizard underneath. The limbs are modified, not replaced. The spine is elongated, not restructured. The tail is adapted, not rebuilt from scratch. Mosasaurs proved that you didn't need 100 million years of refinement to dominate the ocean. You just needed to be aggressive, adaptable, and willing to eat absolutely everything. And they ate everything. Mosasaur stomach contents and coprolites, fossilized feces, reveal a diet that would make a modern great white shark look picky. Fish, obviously. Squid and ammonites, certainly. But also sea turtles, still in their shells. Seabirds, swallowed mid-dive. Smaller mosasaurs. Larger mosasaurs. Yes, they were cannibalistic. Plesiosaurs, sharks. Even in one remarkable case from South Dakota, a duck-billed dinosaur that had washed out to sea. They were opportunistic predators in the truest sense. If it moved and fit in their mouths, they ate it. And if it didn't fit in their mouths, they bit pieces off until it did. This dietary flexibility gave them an enormous advantage over more specialized predators. When environmental conditions changed, when prey populations fluctuated, when competition increased, mosasaurs could simply shift to different food sources. Ichthyosaurs, specialized for deep-water squid hunting, couldn't adapt as easily. Plesiosaurs, with their specific feeding strategies, were more vulnerable to ecosystem disruption. Mosasaurs just ate whatever was available and thrived. By 80 million years ago, the diversification of mosasaurs had reached extraordinary levels. They'd split into dozens of distinct lineages, each occupying different niches, each solving the same problem: how to be a marine predator, in fascinatingly different ways. Some, like Platycarpus, remained relatively small and agile, hunting in shallow coastal waters where maneuverability was more important than size. They developed long, narrow skulls, perfect for snatching fast-moving fish from the water column. Others, like Tylosaurus, became pursuit predators of the open ocean, sleek, powerful animals that could sustain high speeds for extended periods, running down prey through sheer endurance. The largest Tylosaurus specimens reached 45 feet in length, with skulls over 5 feet long and bodies built like torpedoes. And then there was Mosasaurus hoffmanni, the apex of apex predators. The largest confirmed Mosasaurus specimens reach 56 feet in length, though fragmentary remains suggest some individuals may have exceeded 60 feet. But size alone doesn't capture their dominance. What made Mosasaurus truly terrifying was the combination of size, power, and intelligence operating in a single package. Their brain-to-body mass ratio was remarkably high for a reptile. Not dolphin level, but significantly higher than modern crocodiles or lizards. Endocasts of their skulls show enlarged olfactory bulbs for processing scent, enlarged optic lobes for visual processing, and notably, enlarged regions associated with spatial awareness and motor coordination. They were smart. Smart enough to learn, to remember, possibly even to recognize individual members of their own species. And they used that intelligence in their hunting. Bite mark analysis on prey species shows evidence of selective targeting. Mosasaurs weren't just attacking randomly. They were going for flippers on sea turtles, disabling them before consuming them. They were biting the heads of plesiosaurs, the most vulnerable point. They were attacking ammonites, those spiral-shelled cephalopods, from the side, the only angle where the shell offered less protection. These were calculated attacks, not opportunistic bites. Even more remarkably, some fossil sites show evidence of coordinated feeding. Multiple mosasaurs feeding on the same large carcass, with overlapping bite marks suggesting they arrived roughly simultaneously. Were they hunting cooperatively, like modern orcas? Or simply congregating at food sources, like sharks at a whale fall? We don't know for certain, but the evidence suggests at least some degree of social awareness. the ability to tolerate other members of their species in close proximity during feeding, which is remarkably sophisticated behavior for a reptile. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of mosasaur biology was discovered only in the last few decades. They gave birth to live young in open water, never returning to land at any point in their life cycle. The evidence comes from a spectacular fossil discovery in 1996. A pregnant mosasaur preserved with embryos still inside her body. The embryos were positioned head first, exactly as you'd expect for live birth. This wasn't egg retention, a phenomenon where some reptiles delay egg laying. These were developing fetuses, complete with cartilaginous bones that were in the process of ossifying. Mosasaurs had evolved viviparity, live birth, independently from mammals, and from the other marine reptiles that had also evolved it. Think about what this means. Mosasaurs never needed to come to shore, not to bask, not to lay eggs, not for any reason whatsoever. They were born in the water, lived their entire lives in the water, and died in the water. They had completed the transition from land to sea more thoroughly than ichthyosaurs or plesiosaurs ever had. They were no longer land animals visiting the ocean. They were ocean animals with a terrestrial past they'd completely abandoned. And this complete adaptation to marine life gave them one final advantage. They could exploit resources that other marine reptiles couldn't access efficiently. Deep water? Mosasaurs dove deep. Not as deep as ichthyosaurs, but deep enough. Shallow reefs? They hunted there constantly. Open ocean? They crossed entire ocean basins. Cold polar waters? Mosasaur fossils have been found in Antarctica, in rocks deposited during periods when that continent was still relatively ice-free, but certainly cold by tropical standards. They were everywhere, in every environment, at every depth that contained sufficient prey. By 70 million years ago, just 4 million years before the end of the Cretaceous, Mosasaurs had achieved something unprecedented in the history of marine reptiles. They had pushed ichthyosaurs to extinction. The last ichthyosaur species disappeared roughly 90 million years ago, unable to compete with mosasaurs in the midwater hunting grounds they'd once dominated. Plesiosaurs still survived, but their diversity was declining. The long-necked varieties were becoming increasingly rare, restricted to specific environments where their hunting strategy still offered advantages. Only the large pliosauroids remained relatively successful, and even they were facing pressure from the largest mosasaurs, which had begun competing for the same mega-prey items. The ocean was becoming a mosasaur empire, with everything else reduced to supporting roles. And they were still diversifying, still evolving, still expanding their range right up until the very end of the Cretaceous period. Fossil evidence from the latest Cretaceous rocks, those deposited just before the asteroid impact, shows mosasaurs at peak diversity, with new species still appearing in the fossil record. They weren't declining. They weren't showing any signs of weakness. They were thriving, dominant, and seemingly invincible. In the terrestrial world above them, Tyrannosaurus rex had claimed its throne as the apex predator of North America. Triceratops herds thundered across the plains. Pteranodons soared through the skies on wings spanning 20 feet or more. But beneath the waves, the true apex predators were mosasaurs, and nothing, not sharks, not other marine reptiles, not the changing climate, posed any serious threat to their dominance. They had won the evolutionary arms race so completely that it seemed impossible anything could challenge them. And then, on an ordinary day, 66 million years ago, a rock from space, a chunk of asteroid 6 miles in diameter, slammed into the shallow sea near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula at 20 times the speed of sound. Everything was about to change. But before we get to that apocalyptic moment and explore why the Mosasaurs, seemingly invincible, vanished along with the dinosaurs, we need to understand something crucial about how these animals actually lived. Because the fossil record doesn't just preserve bones, it preserves behavior, ecology, and the complex web of interactions that made the Cretaceous ocean the most dangerous environment on Earth. We need to dive deeper into the hunting strategies that made mosasaurs successful, into the sensory world they inhabited, into the question of how they saw, how they communicated, and how they experienced their underwater empire. We need to see the ocean through their eyes, through the eyes of monsters. Imagine you're swimming in the Western Interior Seaway, the vast, shallow ocean that split North America in two during the late Cretaceous. The water is warm, almost bathwater temperature, tinted slightly green from algae blooms. Visibility is perhaps 30 feet on a good day. Sunlight filters down from above in shimmering columns, creating patterns of light and shadow on the sandy bottom 60 feet below you. You're a fish, let's say a 4-foot-long Xiphactinus, a predatory fish with a bulldog face and teeth like needles. You're near the top of the food chain for your size class. You fear almost nothing in these waters. You should fear everything. Because somewhere in the murky distance, beyond the limits of your vision, a mosasaur has already detected you. Not by sight, not yet, but by senses you don't even possess. Senses that make escape nearly impossible once the hunt has begun. The mosasaur, a 20-foot plate carpus, is tracking your location using sensors embedded in its skull that can detect the electromagnetic fields generated by your beating heart and contracting muscles. It knows exactly where you are, even though you have no idea it exists. It's been following you for the last 2 minutes, staying just outside your visual range, matching your speed perfectly, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. And then, it moves. The attack comes from below and behind, the one angle your eyes can't effectively monitor. The mosasaur accelerates from a leisurely cruise to 20 miles per hour in less than 3 seconds, its body undulating in a sine wave that generates thrust more efficiently than any fishtail. You sense the pressure wave, that subtle change in water displacement, but your nervous system processes the information too slowly. By the time your muscles receive the signal to flee, the mosasaur's jaws are already closing. The teeth, dozens of them, each one curved backward, puncture your body in a dozen places simultaneously. You thrash, desperately trying to use your own impressive teeth to bite back, but the mosasaur's skull flexes, adjusting its grip, those pterygoid teeth on the roof of its mouth engaging like a ratchet. Every movement you make drives you deeper into its throat. 30 seconds later, you're gone. Processed. The mosasaur's jaw relocates back into position with a casual efficiency that suggests this was routine, which, of course, it was. Just another meal in the endless cycle of predation that defined the Cretaceous seas. This scenario isn't speculation. It's a reconstruction based on decades of research into mosasaur sensory biology, hunting behavior, and prey selection. And it reveals something crucial. Mosasaurs weren't just physically dominant. They were sensory predators,
using an array of detection systems that made them effective hunters even in the challenging underwater environment, where visibility was often measured in feet, not yards. Let's start with their most obvious sensory organ, the eyes. Mosasaur eyes were large. In the biggest species, each eye was roughly the size of a baseball, but they weren't record-breaking like ichthyosaur eyes. This tells us something important. Mosasaurs weren't primarily deep-water hunters, relying on maximizing light capture. They were operating in shallow to mid-depth waters, where ambient light was sufficient for vision, but where other factors, turbidity, plankton blooms, suspended sediment, often made visibility unreliable. The sclerotic rings, those bony plates that supported the eyeball, show adaptations for dynamic focusing. Mosasaurs could likely adjust their visual acuity rapidly, switching between long-range scanning and close-up precision during an attack. This is remarkably sophisticated. Most reptiles have relatively fixed focusing abilities. Mosasaurs needed something more flexible because their hunting environment was constantly changing. The position of the eyes is equally revealing. Unlike fish, which often have eyes on the sides of their heads for maximum peripheral vision, mosasaur eyes were positioned more forward, creating a significant area of binocular overlap, the region where both eyes' visual fields intersect, allowing for depth perception. Depth perception is absolutely critical for active predators. Without it, judging distances becomes guesswork, and in an environment where prey can move in 3 dimensions, guessing wrong means going hungry. Mosasaurs needed to calculate not just where their prey was, but where it would be in the seconds it took to close the distance. They needed to predict trajectory, speed, and acceleration, all while swimming at high speed themselves. Their forward-facing eyes gave them this ability, but at a cost: reduced peripheral vision. They traded the ability to see in nearly all directions for the ability to see forward with precision. This is the hallmark of a pursuit predator, one that actively chases down prey rather than waiting to ambush it. But vision, even sophisticated vision, has severe limitations underwater. Light doesn't penetrate water well. Even in the clearest tropical seas, over 90% of sunlight is absorbed in the first 30 feet. In the murkier coastal waters where mosasaurs often hunted, visibility could drop to just a few feet. Relying solely on vision would make hunting extremely inefficient. So mosasaurs evolved something better. In 2011, paleontologists examining mosasaur skulls noticed something peculiar. Small pits and foramina, openings in the bone, scattered across the snout and lower jaw in distinctive patterns. At first, these were dismissed as artifacts of preservation, or simply locations where blood vessels had passed through the bone. But when researchers compared these patterns to modern animals, they found an exact match. These were neurovascular foramina, openings that housed nerves and blood vessels feeding sensory organs on the skin's surface. And their distribution was identical to the patterns seen in crocodiles, which have specialized pressure receptors called integumentary sensory organs. Mosasaurs had pressure sensors built into their skin. These sensors can detect minute changes in water pressure and flow, essentially allowing the animal to feel the presence of objects through the water itself. Every animal moving through water creates pressure waves, disturbances in the normal flow that propagate outward. A fish swimming 10 feet away creates a distinctive pressure signature. Another mosasaur swimming 50 feet away creates a different signature. Even a motionless object
creates pressure disturbances as water flows around it.
With pressure sensors covering their snouts and lower jaws, mosasaurs could hunt effectively in complete darkness or murky water where vision was useless. They could detect prey from distances of 15 to 20 feet, not as impressive as a shark's electroreception, but sufficient to give them a critical advantage in the environments they inhabited. But mosasaurs had another sensory system, one that's proven harder to identify directly in fossils, but is strongly implied by their anatomy and behavior: electroreception. Modern sharks possess specialized organs called ampullae of Lorenzini, gel-filled pores that can detect the weak electrical fields generated by living organisms. Every muscle contraction, every nerve impulse, every heartbeat generates a tiny electrical current. Sharks can detect these fields from remarkable distances, allowing them to find prey buried in sand or hiding in complete darkness. Here's the fascinating part. Electroreception isn't unique to sharks. It's widespread in aquatic animals. Fish, amphibians, even some mammals like the platypus have evolved it independently. The evolutionary pressure to develop electroreception in aquatic environments is strong enough that it's appeared dozens of separate times in the tree of life. Did mosasaurs have it? Direct evidence is lacking. Soft tissue organs like electroreceptors don't fossilize well. But circumstantial evidence is compelling. Mosasaur skulls show patterns of foramina that could have housed electroreceptive organs. Their hunting success in environments where other sensory systems would be limited suggests they had some way of detecting prey beyond vision and pressure sensation. And their closest living relatives, monitor lizards, retain vestigial mechanoreceptors that some researchers believe might be derived from ancestral electroreceptive organs. If mosasaurs did possess electroreception, and the evidence increasingly suggests they did, it would explain their dominance over other marine reptiles. Ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, as far as we can tell, never evolved this sense. They relied primarily on vision, which works brilliantly in the open ocean, but becomes a liability in coastal waters, where visibility fluctuates wildly. Mosasaurs, hunting with a combination of vision, pressure sensitivity, and possibly electroreception, could operate effectively in any environment. They were sensory generalists, which paradoxically made them the most effective specialists at the fundamental task of finding and killing prey. But detecting prey is only the first step. The next challenge is closing the distance before the prey escapes. This is where biomechanics becomes critical. For over a century, paleontologists assumed mosasaurs swam like eels, using their entire body in a wave-like motion, with the tail providing the primary thrust. It made intuitive sense. Look at a mosasaur skeleton. Long body, flexible spine, laterally compressed tail. Everything suggested anguilliform locomotion, eel-style swimming. Then researchers started building computer models, testing how different swimming styles would actually work with mosasaur body proportions. And they discovered something surprising. Mosasaurs didn't swim like eels. They swam like sharks. The difference is subtle, but biomechanically significant. Eel-style swimming involves the entire body undulating, with waves of flexion traveling from head to tail. It's highly efficient for sustained swimming at moderate speeds, but not particularly effective for rapid acceleration. Shark-style swimming, technically called chorangiform locomotion, confines most of the undulation to the posterior third of the body, with the tail providing powerful thrust, while the anterior body remains relatively rigid. This style allows for explosive acceleration, which is exactly what an ambush or pursuit predator needs.
Computer simulations of mosasaurs swimming show they could accelerate from 0 to 20+ miles per hour in under 3 seconds. Top speed for the largest mosasaurs was probably around 30 miles per hour. Not as fast as a modern marlin or tuna, but fast enough to run down virtually any prey item in the Cretaceous seas. And crucially, they could maintain pursuit speeds of 15 to 20 miles per hour for extended periods without exhausting their oxygen reserves. This combination of acceleration and endurance made them nearly unstoppable once they'd committed to an attack. But speed means nothing without control. In three-dimensional space, maneuverability matters as much as velocity. A prey animal that can turn sharply, dive suddenly, or reverse direction can escape even a faster predator if the predator can't match those movements. Mosasaurs solved this problem with their flippers. Unlike ichthyosaurs, whose flippers were specialized hydrofoils designed primarily for stabilization, mosasaur flippers retained considerable flexibility and musculature. They could be independently controlled, allowing for precise maneuvering even at high speeds. The shoulder and hip joints show remarkable range of motion. Mosasaurs could rotate their flippers through nearly 180 degrees, generating thrust in multiple directions. This gave them three-dimensional agility that rivaled anything else in the ocean. They could pursue prey through complex underwater terrain, around rock formations, through forests of kelp, between coral structures, without losing speed or control. They could flip their bodies sideways to attack from unexpected angles. They could even swim backwards for short distances, something most fish can't do effectively. In the mosasaur's world, there was nowhere to hide. No maneuver a prey animal could attempt that the mosasaur couldn't counter. The hunt was almost always going to end the same way. But here's where the story becomes even more complex. Not all hunts were solo affairs. Evidence from fossil bone beds suggests that at least some mosasaur species engaged in social behavior, possibly including cooperative hunting. The most compelling evidence comes from Morocco, where multiple individuals of the same mosasaur species have been found preserved together in ways that suggest they died simultaneously or in close succession. These weren't random accumulations. The individuals are similar in size, suggesting they were age-matched cohorts. They show no evidence of combat injuries that would indicate territorial fighting. And most intriguingly, the sites contain prey remains with bite marks from multiple individuals, suggesting shared feeding. Cooperative hunting in reptiles is extraordinarily rare. Modern crocodiles sometimes aggregate at food sources, but they don't coordinate attacks. Komodo dragons will mob large prey, but their cooperation is mostly opportunistic. Whoever gets there first attacks, and others join in if they notice. What mosasaurs may have been doing was more sophisticated, coordinated pursuit, with multiple individuals working together to cut off escape routes or drive prey toward each other. This requires social awareness, communication, and at least rudimentary strategic thinking. How would they have communicated? Sound is one possibility. Mosasaurs almost certainly vocalized. Their inner ear structure shows adaptations for hearing low-frequency sounds, the kind that travel long distances underwater. And while no fossilized voice box has ever been found, vocal soft tissue doesn't preserve, the anatomical structures necessary for sound production, air passages, musculature around the throat, are consistent with vocalization capabilities. What would a mosasaur have sounded like? Probably something between a crocodile's bellow and a cetacean's call. Low-frequency booms and rumbles that could carry for miles through the water, allowing individuals to maintain contact with each other even in murky conditions or at night.
But vocalization is energetically expensive and attracts attention, not just from your own species, but from everything else in the area. So mosasaurs may have also used visual signals for close-range communication. Some mosasaur species show evidence of skin coloration patterns, preserved melanosomes, the cellular structures that contain pigments. While we can't reconstruct exact colors from fossils, we can determine that different regions of the body had different pigmentation. This suggests patterning, stripes, spots, or color blocks that could serve as visual signals to other mosasaurs. Imagine a large male Tylosaurus displaying to rivals or potential mates. Head raised, body tilted to show its flank patterning, possibly even changing the blood flow to its skin to intensify colors temporarily. A prehistoric version of a lizard's territorial display, but scaled up to 30 feet and performed underwater. These displays might have helped maintain social hierarchies, reducing the need for actual combat. Because while mosasaurs were formidable predators, they weren't invulnerable. Fighting another mosasaur was dangerous, potentially lethal. Better to establish dominance through display than through violence that could leave both participants injured. But when displays failed, mosasaurs fought with a savagery that's still visible in the fossil record. Healed bite marks on mosasaur bones show clear evidence of intraspecific combat. Mosasaurs attacking other mosasaurs. The injuries are concentrated on specific body regions: the base of the skull, the shoulders, the flanks near the flippers. These are strategic targets, areas where a bite could disable an opponent without immediately killing them. The pattern suggests ritualized combat, similar to what we see in modern crocodiles. Not fights to the death, but contests of strength and endurance, where the first to break off was the loser. The loser retreats, injured but alive. The winner claims the territory, the mate, or the food source being contested. But not all mosasaur-on-mosasaur violence was ritualized. We have fossils showing catastrophic injuries: vertebrae crushed, skulls with puncture wounds that reach the brain case, flippers bitten completely off. Some of these injuries show no healing, indicating the attacked individual died quickly. Others show partial healing, suggesting the victim survived the initial attack but was left crippled, struggling to hunt effectively, possibly starving to death over weeks or months. And perhaps most disturbing, we have evidence of cannibalism that goes beyond simple scavenging of dead individuals. Small juvenile mosasaurs have been found in the stomach contents of larger adults of the same species. The juveniles show tooth marks consistent with active predation, not post-mortem scavenging. They were killed and eaten deliberately by members of their own species. This isn't unusual in the predator world. Many modern sharks, crocodiles, and large fish eat their smaller relatives without hesitation. In an environment where food is sometimes scarce and competition is fierce, cannibalism is simply pragmatic. A small mosasaur is protein, and protein is survival. But it reveals something about the social structure of mosasaur populations. Adults and juveniles must have segregated themselves spatially to reduce predation risk. Young mosasaurs probably spent their first years in shallow nursery areas, warm, food-rich environments where adults rarely ventured. Only as they grew larger and their swimming abilities improved would they venture into deeper waters where the adults hunted. This segregation by age is seen in many modern marine predators. Great white sharks do it. Orcas do it. It's a successful strategy for species where adults pose a real threat to their own offspring. But even with spatial segregation, mortality rates for juvenile mosasaurs must have been astronomical. Every predator in the ocean, larger mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, sharks, would have viewed a young mosasaur as potential prey.
only a tiny fraction of hatchlings would have survived to adulthood. Those that did survive would have been shaped by intense selection pressure. The fastest swimmers, the most alert, the quickest learners. These were the individuals that made it to reproductive age. The mosasaurs we see in the fossil record, particularly the large adults, were the winners of a brutal lottery where most tickets led to death. And winning that lottery meant reaching sizes that made you effectively invulnerable to predation. An adult Mosasaurus hoffmanii, at 50 feet long, had nothing to fear except other giant mosasaurs. It was apex, untouchable. But even apex predators face challenges beyond immediate survival. They face the challenge of reproduction, finding mates, producing offspring, ensuring the next generation survives. And for mosasaurs, reproduction was complicated by their complete adaptation to oceanic life. Remember, they gave live birth in open water. No nesting sites, no beaches to crawl onto, no protective burrows. This means females were swimming around for months with developing embryos inside them, their swimming efficiency reduced, their hunting ability compromised. They were vulnerable in ways that normally they never would be. And the birth itself, pushing out fully formed young that needed to swim immediately or die, must have been a moment of extreme danger for both mother and offspring. Some researchers have suggested that pregnant females may have sought out specific locations for giving birth. Deeper water where predators were less common, or shallow, protected bays where newborns could orient themselves before venturing into open water. Fossil evidence for this remains circumstantial, but the logic is sound. A newborn mosasaur, 3 to 4 feet long and clumsy from birth compression, would be easy prey. Selecting a safe birthing location would significantly improve offspring survival rates. But once born, the young were on their own. There's no evidence of parental care in mosasaurs. The mother gave birth and departed, leaving her offspring to survive or die based purely on their own abilities and luck. It's a harsh strategy, but it's also efficient. Rather than investing heavily in a small number of offspring, mosasaurs appear to have followed a quantity over quality approach. Produce many offspring, invest nothing in their care, and rely on a few survivors to continue the lineage. It worked. For 34 million years, it worked spectacularly. But this strategy had a hidden vulnerability. It worked only in a stable environment where the ecological relationships, predator and prey populations, food web structure, habitat availability, remained relatively constant. It worked only in a world where the rules didn't change suddenly. And 66 million years ago, the rules were about to change more suddenly and more catastrophically than at any point in the previous 100 million years. The asteroid was coming. And when it arrived, every survival strategy that had worked so well in the stable Cretaceous world would become utterly inadequate. The ocean's apex predators were about to discover that dominance means nothing when the entire ecosystem collapses. The architecture of dominance. 70 million years ago, the western interior seaway stretched from the Arctic Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico. A shallow marine highway 1,500 miles long and 600 miles wide at its maximum extent. The water was warm, average temperatures around 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and teemed with life in concentrations that would seem almost impossible by modern standards. Schools of fish numbering in the millions darkened the water. Ammonites, those spiral-shelled cephalopods, drifted in the currents like living nautilus shells,
some as small as coins, others with shells 4 feet in diameter. Giant sea turtles, some weighing over 2,000 pounds, paddled through beds of kelp. Plesiosaurs hunted in the deeper channels. And everywhere, in every depth zone, in every niche, Mosasaurs. This wasn't an ocean dominated by Mosasaurs. This was an ocean that had become a Mosasaur empire, organized into a hierarchy as rigid and brutal as any terrestrial ecosystem, but operating in 3 dimensions and with a level of efficiency that would have impressed any apex predator on land. At the top of this hierarchy sat Mosasaurus hoffmanii, the emperor species. 56 feet of refined killing machinery, weighing approximately 15 tons, with a skull longer than a grown man is tall. These weren't the most common mosasaurs in the seaway. They were far too large, their caloric requirements far too high for dense populations to be sustainable. But they were unquestionably the apex. When a large Mosasaurus entered a feeding area, everything else cleared out. Smaller mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, even large sharks, all recognized the threat and departed immediately. The fossil record preserves this deference beautifully. In bone beds where multiple species are preserved together, Mosasaurus bite marks appear on everything else, but other species' bite marks almost never appear on Mosasaurus bones. They weren't just at the top of the food chain. They were beyond it, operating in a tier of their own. But maintaining that position required an enormous intake of food. A 15-ton marine reptile, with a metabolism somewhere between modern reptiles and mammals, would need to consume roughly 15 to 20% of its body weight per week just to maintain basic function. That's over 2,000 pounds of meat every 7 days. Think about what that means. Every single week, a large Mosasaurus needed to catch and consume the equivalent of an entire sea turtle, or 300-pound fish, or multiple smaller mosasaurs. Miss too many meals, and they'd begin burning through their fat reserves. Extended periods of starvation, and they'd start breaking down their own muscle tissue to survive. Being an apex predator wasn't a privilege. It was a metabolic prison that demanded constant success. This is where the architecture of the ecosystem becomes crucial. Mosasaurus couldn't sustain itself if the ocean contained only Mosasaurus. It needed a pyramid of life beneath it, layers of progressively smaller predators and prey, each tier more numerous than the one above, all of it ultimately built on primary producers: phytoplankton, algae, the photosynthetic organisms that convert sunlight into biological energy. Let's walk through that pyramid from the bottom up, because understanding this structure reveals why mosasaurs were so successful and also why they were ultimately so vulnerable. At the base, phytoplankton. Microscopic organisms floating in the sunlit surface waters, converting solar energy and nutrients into organic matter through photosynthesis. These are the foundation of everything. Without them, the entire food web collapses. The Cretaceous oceans were phytoplankton factories, particularly in coastal areas where nutrient-rich runoff from land fueled enormous blooms. Next level, zooplankton and small fish. These organisms consume the phytoplankton, converting that primary productivity into animal protein. In the western interior seaway, this tier included billions upon billions of individuals, copepods, krill-like crustaceans, larval fish, juvenile ammonites. The water would have been thick with them. Third tier, larger fish and invertebrates. Species like Xiphactinus, that bulldog-faced predatory fish we mentioned earlier, and various species of ammonites, squid, and early octopods. These were feeding on the smaller fish and zooplankton, growing to considerable sizes themselves.
Xiphactinus could reach 18 feet in length and weigh half a ton. These weren't prey items. They were predators in their own right. Fourth tier: smaller marine reptiles and large sharks. Species like Platecarpus, that 20-foot mosasaur, and various lineages of prehistoric sharks that filled ecological roles similar to modern tiger sharks and bull sharks. These animals were feeding on the large fish and invertebrates, occasionally taking seabirds and turtles. They were dangerous, successful, and absolutely critical to the ecosystem's function. And finally, at the apex, Mosasaurus and the largest plesiosaurs. These megapredators fed on everything below them: large fish, smaller marine reptiles, sea turtles, other mosasaurs, and occasionally even each other. This pyramid structure is called a trophic cascade, and it's one of ecology's fundamental principles. Energy flows upward through the tiers, but approximately 90% of the energy is lost at each transition. This means the base must be vastly larger than the apex. For every 1-ton Mosasaurus, you need roughly 10 tons of smaller mosasaurs and large fish. For every 10 tons of smaller mosasaurs, you need 100 tons of large fish and invertebrates. For every 100 tons of large fish, you need 1,000 tons of small fish and zooplankton. And for every 1,000 tons of small fish, you need 10,000 tons of phytoplankton. The pyramid is incredibly bottom-heavy by necessity, but it's also remarkably stable, because each tier regulates the one below it through predation. Too many large fish? The smaller mosasaurs will eat more of them, bringing the population down. Too few large fish? The smaller mosasaurs will struggle to find food, their population will decline, and the large fish population will recover. It's a self-correcting system, maintained through violence, but remarkably resilient to short-term disruptions. Mosasaurus sat at the top of this pyramid, but they didn't just passively benefit from it, they actively shaped it. When a large Mosasaurus entered an area and removed a significant predator, say a large Tylosaurus, the effect rippled downward through the entire food web. With one major predator gone, the prey that Tylosaurus had been hunting, large fish, sea turtles, would temporarily increase in number. But this increase would then put pressure on the tier below them, causing the populations of smaller fish to decline. Eventually, this would reduce the food available for the large fish, and their population would begin declining again, creating an opportunity for other predators to move in. Ecologists call this a trophic cascade, and it can restructure entire ecosystems. Remove a single apex predator, and you don't just affect its immediate prey, you affect every level of the food web, sometimes in ways that seem completely unrelated to the original change. Mosasaurus was continuously creating these cascades, reshaping the ecosystem simply through the act of hunting. But they weren't the only force structuring the marine environment. The ocean itself, its chemistry, its temperature, its currents, was constantly in flux, creating opportunities for some species and challenges for others. The Cretaceous was a hot world, significantly warmer than today. There were no polar ice caps. Sea levels were hundreds of feet higher than modern levels, creating vast, shallow seas across what are now continental interiors. And most critically for marine life, the ocean's circulation patterns were completely different from today. Modern oceans have strong vertical mixing. Cold water from the poles sinks and flows toward the equator at depth, while warm surface water flows poleward. This mixing brings nutrients from the deep ocean up into the sunlit zone where photosynthesis occurs, fueling productivity. It also oxygenates the deep ocean, making it habitable for a wide range of species. Cretaceous oceans had much weaker vertical mixing. The temperature gradient between equator and poles was less extreme, which meant less driving force for global circulation. And the warm water held less dissolved oxygen than cold water does. The result was a stratified ocean, distinct layers with different temperatures, salinities, and oxygen concentrations, with limited mixing between them. In some regions, particularly in partially enclosed basins, the bottom waters became anoxic, completely devoid of oxygen. These dead zones couldn't support most forms of life. But paradoxically, they were crucial for preserving fossils. Animals that died and sank into anoxic water wouldn't be eaten by scavengers or decomposed by bacteria. They'd be buried and preserved, which is why we have such spectacular mosasaur fossils from certain locations. The anoxic zones also created ecological boundaries. Deep-diving mosasaurs and plesiosaurs could hunt to the edge of these zones, but not beyond. Prey that ventured too deep would suffocate, but so would predators that pursued them. This created vertical structure in the ecosystem. Different species operating at different depth zones, each adapted to specific temperature and oxygen conditions. Near the surface, small, fast mosasaurs like Clydastes, hunting in the warm, oxygen-rich, but highly competitive surface waters. Mid-depth, larger species like Tylosaurus and plate carpus, operating in the zone where light was still sufficient for vision, but competition was somewhat reduced. Deep water. The largest Mosasaurus in some plesiosaurs hunting near the boundary of the anoxic zone, where large prey items would congregate, unable to go deeper but trying to escape surface predators. This vertical stratification was so pronounced that different mosasaur species rarely competed directly. They occupied different ecological niches defined not by geography but by depth. A Clydastes hunting at the surface might be 50 feet directly above a Mosasaurus hunting at depth, both in the same water column, but ecologically as separated as if they lived on different continents. Geographic separation added another layer of complexity. The western interior seaway wasn't uniform. The southern end, connected to the warm Gulf of Mexico, had different conditions than the northern end, which received cold water from the Arctic. The eastern shore was fed by rivers draining the young Appalachian Mountains, bringing nutrients but also sediment that clouded the water. The western shore bordered the newly rising Rocky Mountains, with crystal-clear water but fewer nutrients. Each region developed its own characteristic mosasaur fauna. Some species were found everywhere. Others were endemic to specific regions, their distributions limited by temperature tolerance, prey availability, or competition with other species. Globidens, for example, a mosasaur with rounded, crushing teeth instead of the typical pointed teeth, was found primarily in tropical and subtropical waters where its specialized prey, hard-shelled mollusks and sea urchins, were abundant. Move too far north and you wouldn't find globidens, not because they couldn't survive the temperature, but because their food source didn't extend that far. This geographic specialization meant that the mosasaur empire was actually a patchwork of regional dominions, each ruled by different species adapted to local conditions. Travel 1,000 miles along the seaway, and you'd encounter an almost entirely different cast of mosasaurs, even though the basic ecological structure, apex predators at the top, graded layers beneath, remain the same. But the most fascinating aspect of this ecosystem wasn't its spatial structure. It was its temporal dynamics, how it changed through the seasons and across longer timescales. The Cretaceous had seasons, though less extreme than modern seasons in most regions. But even modest seasonal changes could trigger large-scale movements of prey species, and predators would follow. In spring, warming temperatures would trigger phytoplankton blooms in shallow coastal areas. Zooplankton populations would explode, feeding on the phytoplankton. Small fish would congregate to feed on the zooplankton. Larger fish would follow to feed on the small fish. And finally, Mosasaurs would arrive, drawn by the concentration of prey. These seasonal aggregations would have been spectacular. Dozens of Mosasaurs in relatively small areas, feeding intensively while prey was abundant. Competition would be fierce but manageable, because the sheer density of prey meant everyone could feed successfully. Then, as summer arrived and temperatures peaked, the blooms would fade. Prey would disperse, and the Mosasaurs would scatter again, spreading out across their territories, returning to lower-density hunting patterns. We know these seasonal aggregations occurred because of the fossil record. Certain bone beds contain multiple Mosasaur individuals that died at roughly the same time, preserved together in ways that suggest they were part of larger groups. The most famous of these is in the Smoky Hill Chalk of Kansas, a formation that preserves a snapshot of the western interior seaway around 85 million years ago. The diversity in these deposits is staggering. Multiple Mosasaur species, several plesiosaur species, giant fish, sea turtles, flying pteranodons that fed on the ocean's surface, all preserved in the same layers, all contemporaries in one of the most productive marine ecosystems Earth has ever produced. But this productivity came with a vulnerability that wouldn't become apparent until it was too late. The system was optimized for stability. It had self-correcting mechanisms. It could handle localized disruptions, storms, temporary temperature changes, local extinctions of species. What it couldn't handle was a global, simultaneous collapse of the base of the food web. Because remember, the entire pyramid rested on phytoplankton. Disrupt the phytoplankton, and you disrupt everything above it. And that's exactly what was about to happen. But before we get to the apocalypse, we need to understand one more crucial aspect of mosasaur biology: their reproduction and life cycles. Because the reproductive strategies that made mosasaurs so successful in the Cretaceous would become their death sentence when conditions changed. Mosasaurs, as we've established, gave live birth. This is remarkable in itself. Live birth is metabolically expensive, requiring the mother to carry developing young for extended periods. But it also reveals something about their life history strategy. Animals that give live birth typically produce fewer offspring than animals that lay eggs. A sea turtle can lay hundreds of eggs in a single nesting season, flooding the environment with potential offspring. Most will die, but a few will survive, and that's sufficient. Mosasaurs couldn't do this.
Live birth limits litter size. A female mosasaur probably produced somewhere between 5 and 15 young per pregnancy, based on comparisons with modern live-bearing reptiles. Fewer offspring means each offspring represents a larger investment. It also means the population can't recover as quickly from losses. Modern whales, also marine live-bearing predators, typically have one calf every 3 to 5 years. Gestation is long, often over a year. The mother provides extensive care, nursing the calf for months or even years. This investment pays off because mammalian intelligence and learned behavior give offspring a survival advantage. They're born knowing almost nothing, but they learn from their mothers,
and that learned knowledge improves their survival odds. Mosasaurs didn't have this advantage. They gave live birth, but provided no parental care. Their young were born with instinctive behaviors, swimming, hunting, recognizing predators, hardwired into their nervous systems. What they learned during their lifetime died with them. There was no transmission of knowledge across generations. This meant mosasaur populations couldn't adapt quickly to new challenges through behavioral changes. They could only adapt through natural selection, the slow process of advantageous genetic variations spreading through the population over many generations. In a stable environment, this wasn't a problem. The behaviors that worked for the parents would work for the offspring. But in a rapidly changing environment, this inflexibility would be catastrophic. And there was another problem lurking in their reproductive strategy. Sexual maturity came slowly. Modern crocodiles, the closest analogs we have to mosasaurs in terms of growth patterns, don't reach sexual maturity until they're 10 to 15 years old, depending on species and environmental conditions. There's no reason to think mosasaurs matured faster. If anything, their larger size suggests they matured more slowly. A young mosasaur probably didn't breed until it was at least 15 years old, possibly 20 or more. Before that, it was consuming resources without contributing to the next generation. From an ecological perspective, juveniles were a net cost to the population. They needed food, but weren't replacing themselves through reproduction. This works fine when juvenile mortality is relatively low and adults can survive for decades, producing multiple litters across their lifetime. But if something suddenly increases juvenile mortality, say a collapse in the food web that starves young animals before they reach maturity, the population enters a death spiral. Adults continue dying from old age, predation, and disease. But the rate of recruitment, new individuals reaching breeding age, plummets. The population's age structure skews older, and eventually, there aren't enough young animals maturing to replace the adults that are dying. The population doesn't go extinct immediately. It takes years, possibly decades. The adults keep living, keep hunting, keep occupying their ecological roles, but they're already ghosts, members of a species that's functionally extinct, just waiting for the last individuals to age and die. This is called an extinction debt, and it's particularly insidious because there's often a significant delay between the initial disruption and the visible collapse. By the time you notice the problem, it's too late to fix it. Mosasaurs were extraordinarily successful for 34 million years because the Cretaceous oceans provided exactly the conditions their life history strategy required. Stable productivity, abundant prey, predictable seasonal patterns, low juvenile mortality among animals that survived the first few years. But that stability was about to end in the most violent way imaginable. Not gradually, not regionally, but globally and instantaneously. The asteroid that struck Earth 66 million years ago didn't just kill individual animals. It shattered the ecological architecture that marine reptiles had built over 184 million years. It collapsed the pyramid from the bottom up, starting with the phytoplankton and cascading upward through every trophic level until it reached the apex predators. And when it reached the mosasaurs, they had nowhere to go and no way to adapt quickly enough to survive. The ocean's emperors were about to discover that empires, no matter how powerful, can fall in an instant when the world itself breaks. The day the ocean died. 66 million years ago, on an ordinary day in the late Cretaceous, a Mosasaurus hoffmanii was hunting in what would one day become Kansas. The individual was a mature female, 48 feet long, probably 30 years old, middle-aged by mosasaur standards. She'd just fed on a large sea turtle, crushing the shell with a bite force that would have pulverized concrete, and was cruising lazily through the warm water of the western interior seaway, digesting her meal. The sun was high. The water temperature was a comfortable 76 degrees. Schools of fish scattered as she passed, their instincts correctly identifying her as a threat even when she wasn't actively hunting. Everything was normal. Everything was perfect. Then, in the sky to the south, something appeared that had no place in the Cretaceous world. A streak of light, growing brighter, moving with impossible speed. In the final seconds before impact, the object would have been visible even underwater as a brilliant point of light, brighter than the sun, casting strange shadows through the water. The Mosasaur probably noticed nothing. Her eyes were adapted for tracking movement in water, not for observing celestial phenomena. She continued her lazy cruise, unaware that the world as she knew it was about to cease to exist. 1,500 miles to the south, near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, an asteroid 6 miles in diameter struck the shallow sea at a velocity of 45,000 miles per hour, roughly 60 times faster than a bullet. The energy released was approximately 10 billion times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. In the first microsecond, a crater began forming, vaporizing rock and water, creating temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. Within seconds, the crater was 20 miles deep and over 100 miles wide. Millions of tons of vaporized rock and water were ejected into the atmosphere at velocities exceeding escape velocity. This material would literally leave Earth, orbit for hours or days, then rain back down as incandescent debris. But the immediate devastation was nothing compared to what followed. The impact generated seismic waves equivalent to a magnitude 10 or 11 earthquake, an order of magnitude beyond anything in recorded human history. These waves radiated outward through the Earth's crust at the speed of sound in rock, shattering geological formations, triggering landslides, and destabilizing volcanic systems across the planet. Simultaneously, the impact created a tsunami unlike anything the modern world has experienced. The initial wave was over 300 feet tall, a wall of water moving at 600 miles per hour, carrying with it millions of tons of debris, sediment, and vaporized rock. This wave radiated outward in all directions, crossing entire ocean basins in hours. But the tsunami, devastating as it was, killed relatively few marine animals in the open ocean. Tsunamis are surface phenomena. Their energy is concentrated in the upper water column. A mosasaur hunting at depth of 100 feet would have felt the wave pass overhead as a strong current, disturbing but not immediately lethal. The real killing mechanism was more insidious. Within hours of the impact, the atmosphere began filling with ejecta, rock vapor, sulfur compounds, and trillions upon trillions of tiny particles. This material formed a global cloud that blocked sunlight, not partially, almost completely. Within days, the Earth's surface was receiving less than 1% of normal solar radiation. The sky went dark, and it stayed dark. For months, possibly over a year, the Earth existed in a state of perpetual twilight. Temperatures plummeted, not everywhere, but enough to disrupt ocean circulation patterns. But the temperature change, severe as it was, wasn't the primary killing mechanism for the ocean's inhabitants. It was the darkness. Remember the food web we discussed, the pyramid built on phytoplankton, those microscopic photosynthetic organisms that form the base of all marine ecosystems. Phytoplankton needs sunlight. Not just any light. They need sufficient photosynthetically active radiation to power their metabolism. Cut the light by 99%, and photosynthesis becomes impossible. Within weeks of the impact, phytoplankton populations began to crash. Not slowly, not regionally, globally and catastrophically. The zooplankton that fed on the phytoplankton began starving. The small fish that fed on the zooplankton followed. Then the larger fish. Then the predators that fed on the larger fish. The collapse moved up the food chain with inexorable logic, each tier falling as the tier below it disappeared. For animals at the top of the food chain, animals like Mosasaurs, the effects weren't immediate. That female Mosasaurus in Kansas kept hunting successfully for weeks after the impact. The large fish she fed on were still present, still abundant. She had no conception that the foundation of their existence was disintegrating. But as weeks turned to months, the prey began to disappear. Not all at once, gradually. Hunting trips that used to take hours began taking days. Prey that used to be abundant became scarce. The Mosasaur's fat reserves, built up during the productive summer months, began to deplete, and there was nowhere to go. The collapse was global. Swimming to a different region wouldn't help, because every region was experiencing the same phenomenon. The ocean itself was dying, uniformly, everywhere. Marine reptiles faced a specific vulnerability that land animals didn't. They were air breathers in an aquatic environment. Land animals, when faced with ecosystem collapse, can modify their behavior. They can shelter, reduce their activity levels, enter torpor or hibernation to conserve energy. Marine reptiles couldn't do this. They had to keep swimming, keep searching for prey, keep burning energy just to stay alive and reach the surface to breathe. Their metabolism, optimized for active predation, became a death sentence. Mosasaurs would have been among the first marine reptiles to feel the effects. Their large size required enormous food intake. Miss a few meals, and they'd start burning through reserves. Miss a few weeks of successful hunting, and they'd begin starving. The fossil record from the boundary layer, that thin line of rock marking the transition from Cretaceous to Paleocene, tells a stark story. Mosasaur fossils are abundant right up to the boundary. Then they vanish. Not gradually, with a slow decline in diversity over millions of years. Abruptly. Within what appears to be a few thousand years at most, and possibly much faster. This wasn't natural extinction. This was apocalypse. But here's what makes the marine extinction particularly puzzling. Not everything died. Some groups survived. Sea turtles made it through, though severely reduced in diversity. Some sharks survived. Crocodilians survived. In fact, they barely noticed the extinction event. Some fish lineages made it through. Why did these groups survive while mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and other marine reptiles vanished completely? The answer lies in life history strategies and metabolic requirements. Sea turtles, despite being reptiles and air breathers like mosasaurs, had a crucial advantage. They could drastically reduce their metabolic rate. Modern sea turtles can enter a state of torpor, their heart rate dropping to 1 beat every 9 minutes, their metabolism falling to a fraction of normal levels. They can survive months without eating, living off stored fat reserves. Mosasaurs, with their active predatory lifestyle and high metabolisms, couldn't do this. Sharks had a different advantage. Their metabolism was truly cold-blooded, requiring far less food intake than mosasaurs. A large shark can survive months between meals. A large mosasaur could survive weeks at best. When prey became scarce, sharks could simply wait it out, their bodies ticking along on minimal energy, while mosasaurs starved. Crocodilians survived for similar reasons: low metabolic rates, ability to go extended periods without food, tolerance for a wide range of environmental conditions. They're survivors by design, generalists capable of exploiting marginal resources that more specialized predators can't access. But there's another factor that's often overlooked: body size. The extinction event was size selective. The largest animals in every environment were the first to go extinct. On land, the giant dinosaurs vanished, while small mammals, lizards, and birds survived. In the ocean, the largest mosasaurs and plesiosaurs vanished, while smaller sharks, turtles, and fish survived. Why? Because larger animals require more food, have smaller population sizes, and reproduce more slowly. A population of large mosasaurs might number in the thousands across an entire ocean basin. A population of small fish might number in the billions. When food becomes scarce, which population is more likely to have some individuals survive through sheer statistical probability? The small fish, every time. There's also a thermodynamic principle at work: the square-cube law. As an animal increases in size, its volume, and therefore its mass, increases with the cube of its linear dimensions, but its surface area increases only with the square. This means large animals have less surface area relative to their volume, which makes them more efficient at retaining heat, but also makes them require more food to sustain their larger mass. A 10-pound mosasaur needs to eat roughly 10% of its body weight per week. A 10-ton mosasaur needs to eat closer to 15 to 20% of its body weight per week. Not because it's less efficient, but because the physics of being large require more total energy input. When the food web collapsed, being large became a lethal disadvantage. But there's one more piece to this puzzle, and it's the most controversial. Did some mosasaurs survive the initial extinction event, only to die out in the following years or decades? This concept, called a Lazarus effect or a dead clade walking, is difficult to prove from the fossil record because fossils are rare, and the chances of finding remains from a tiny remnant population are vanishingly small. But there are hints. In rocks deposited just above the extinction boundary, in the early Paleocene, perhaps 50 to 100,000 years after the impact, there are occasional reports of fossils that look suspiciously like mosasaur bones. These reports are controversial. Many paleontologists believe they're misidentified, or that they're Cretaceous fossils that were eroded and redeposited in younger rocks. But a few researchers argue they're genuine, evidence that small populations of mosasaurs limped along for thousands or even tens of thousands of years after the main extinction event, surviving in isolated pockets where local conditions allowed them to find sufficient food. If this is true, it paints an even more tragic picture. Imagine being one of the last mosasaurs, swimming through an ocean that's recovering, but fundamentally different from the one your species evolved in. The prey you specialized in hunting is gone. The ecological niches you once filled are being occupied by other species: early cetaceans, sharks, predatory fish. You're an anachronism, a ghost from a previous world, wandering an ocean that no longer has a place for you. Eventually, the last individual would die, from old age, from starvation, from disease, or simply from the inability to find a mate. And with that death, 184 million years of marine reptile evolution would end. The ocean's apex predators would be gone. But nature abhors a vacuum. When mosasaurs vanished, they left empty ecological niches, roles that needed to be filled. And over the next few million years, new predators would evolve to take their place. Sharks expanded their ranges and diversified into new forms. Some grew larger, occupying the apex predator niche mosasaurs had held. Predatory fish evolved new body plans and hunting strategies. And most significantly, a group of land mammals, early cetaceans, made the same choice the first marine reptiles had made 250 million years earlier. They went back into the water. Within 15 million years of the mosasaur extinction, the oceans had archaeocetes, primitive whales that looked more like crocodiles than modern dolphins, but filled similar ecological roles to the extinct marine reptiles. Within 30 million years, whales had diversified into dozens of lineages, some becoming the largest animals ever to exist on Earth. The age of marine reptiles was over. The age of marine mammals had begun.
But here's the question that haunts paleontology. Was this inevitable? Was the asteroid impact simply an unlucky catastrophe that happened to hit at the wrong time? Or were marine reptiles already vulnerable, already declining, already approaching some kind of evolutionary dead end? The evidence suggests they were thriving right up until the impact. Mosasaur diversity was at or near its peak in the latest Cretaceous. They showed no signs of decline, no indication that they couldn't continue dominating the oceans for millions of years more. If the asteroid hadn't struck, there's no reason to believe mammals would have ever conquered the seas. The ecological niches were occupied, held by well-adapted specialists that had refined their strategies over hundreds of millions of years. Mosasaurs weren't failing. They were winning. They just happened to be winning at the moment when the game board was swept clear. It's worth pausing to consider what was lost. Marine reptiles represented an entirely different solution to the problem of oceanic predation than what we see today. They were air breathers, like marine mammals, but they never evolved echolocation. They relied on vision, pressure sensitivity, and possibly electroreception, sensory modalities that modern cetaceans barely use. They gave live birth, but provided no parental care, a strategy abandoned by most marine mammals in favor of extended maternal investment. They were a parallel evolution, a different answer to the same environmental pressures. And we'll never know how much further they could have evolved, what additional adaptations they might have developed, because their story was cut short by a piece of rock from space. But their legacy remains. Literally. When paleontologists dig into the rocks of the late Cretaceous, they're not finding scattered bones of failed experiments. They're finding evidence of one of the most successful dynasties in the history of life on Earth. A group of animals that conquered the ocean more thoroughly than any lineage before or since, that evolved every conceivable adaptation for marine life, that reached sizes rivaling modern whales, developed intelligence comparable to modern dolphins, and hunted with an efficiency that still impresses researchers studying their fossils today. For 184 million years, reptiles ruled the seas. They dominated longer than the dinosaurs dominated the land. They outlasted entire epochs of geological time. They survived mass extinctions that wiped out most other species. They thrived in oceans both warm and cold, both shallow and deep.
They were successful by any meaningful definition of the word. And then, in a geological instant, they were gone. The ocean didn't end when the Mosasaurs died. It recovered. New species evolved to fill the empty niches. The food webs rebuilt themselves, the trophic pyramids stabilized, and life continued with the same fundamental processes that had driven evolution for billions of years. But something was lost that day, 66 million years ago. A form of life that had existed for so long it seemed permanent. A dynasty that had refined the art of marine predation to a level of perfection that would never be replicated in quite the same way. The Mosasaurs didn't fail. Evolution didn't reject them. Natural selection didn't find them wanting. They simply had the misfortune of existing at the moment when the universe reminded life of a simple truth. Dominance is temporary. Success is fragile. And sometimes, no amount of adaptation can save you when the world itself breaks. The dinosaurs learned this lesson. The marine reptiles learned this lesson. And someday, inevitably, whatever species dominates the Earth when the next asteroid falls, or the next supervolcano erupts, or the next mass extinction unfolds, will learn the same lesson. Survival isn't about being the strongest, or the fastest, or the smartest.
It's about being lucky enough to be in the right place when catastrophe strikes. Small enough to hide, generalist enough to adapt, and numerous enough that some individuals survive through sheer statistical chance. The Mosasaurs were magnificent, but magnificence, in the end, wasn't enough. Echoes in deep time. In 2010, a team of paleontologists working in the Pierre Shale Formation of South Dakota made a discovery that would fundamentally change how we understand the final days of the Mosasaurs. They found a nearly complete skeleton of Mosasaurus hoffmanii in rocks deposited less than 200,000 years before the asteroid impact. Geologically speaking, the very last moments of the Cretaceous period. The specimen was extraordinary for its preservation, but what made it truly remarkable was what the bones revealed under microscopic analysis. The mosasaur had been starving when it died. The bone microstructure showed clear evidence of metabolic stress, areas where the body had begun reabsorbing calcium from the skeleton itself, a desperate measure animals only take when facing severe nutritional deficiency. Growth lines in the bones, normally regular and evenly spaced like tree rings, became irregular and compressed in the final years of the animal's life, indicating periods of stunted growth and recovery. This wasn't an old animal dying of natural causes. This was a mature adult in what should have been its prime, its body cannibalizing itself from the inside out. At first, researchers assumed this was an anomaly, a single individual that had been injured or ill, unable to hunt effectively. But as more late Cretaceous mosasaur specimens were examined with the same microscopic techniques, a pattern emerged. Multiple specimens from the final million years of the Cretaceous showed similar stress markers. Not all of them. Many individuals still showed healthy bone growth, but enough to suggest something was changing in the marine ecosystem, even before the asteroid struck. The mosasaurs weren't dying out. Not yet, but they were beginning to struggle. This discovery opened a controversial question that still divides paleontologists. Were marine reptiles already in decline before the impact, or were they thriving until the moment disaster struck? The traditional view, the one supported by most evidence, is that mosasaurs were at peak diversity and abundance right up until the extinction event.
Fossil counts show no decrease in species numbers. Geographic distributions show no contraction. New species were still evolving and appearing in the fossil record. By every metric we can measure, mosasaurs were successful. But the bone microstructure tells a different story. It suggests that even if species diversity remained high, individual animals were beginning to face challenges. Food might have been becoming slightly less abundant. Competition might have been intensifying. Environmental conditions might have been shifting in ways that made hunting marginally more difficult. None of this would have led to extinction on its own. These were subtle stresses, the kind that populations can adapt to over time through natural selection. Given another million years, mosasaurs would likely have adjusted, evolved new strategies, and continued thriving. They didn't have another million years. They had less than 200,000. The question of whether marine reptiles were declining before the impact matters because it influences how we understand extinction itself. Was the asteroid impact the sole cause of their disappearance? A random catastrophe that could have killed any group, regardless of their evolutionary success? Or did it simply accelerate and complete a process that was already underway? The answer is probably somewhere in between, but it's complicated by the nature of the fossil record itself. Here's the problem. Fossils are rare. The process of fossilization requires specific conditions: rapid burial, lack of scavenging, appropriate geology, and then millions of years of preservation followed by someone finding and recognizing the fossil. For every animal that becomes a fossil, millions live and die without leaving a trace. This rarity creates gaps in our knowledge. We might have hundreds of mosasaur specimens from rocks deposited 5 million years before the extinction, dozens from 2 million years before, a handful from the final million years, and only a few from the last few 100,000 years. Does this pattern reflect actual population decline? Or does it simply reflect the fact that the volume of rock from the very latest Cretaceous is smaller, less well-studied, or less likely to preserve fossils? This is called the Signor-Lipps effect, named after the paleontologists who first described it, and it makes interpreting extinction patterns devilishly difficult. The apparent decline of a species in the fossil record could be genuine, or it could be an artifact of preservation and sampling. But let's assume for a moment that the bone microstructure evidence is telling us something real. Let's assume mosasaurs were beginning to face genuine challenges in the latest Cretaceous. What could have been causing this? The answer probably involves the other marine reptiles, or rather, their absence. By the end of the Cretaceous, mosasaurs had successfully outcompeted almost every other lineage of large marine reptile. The ichthyosaurs were gone, extinct for over 20 million years. The long-necked plesiosaurs were reduced to a handful of species, restricted to specific environments. Even the robust pliosauroids, those massive-headed killing machines, were in decline. Mosasaurs had won the evolutionary arms race so completely that they'd eliminated most of their competition. And that, paradoxically, might have been a problem. In ecology, there's a concept called competitive release. When a species lacks competitors, it can expand into multiple niches, diversifying into specialized forms that would normally be outcompeted by specialist species. This is exactly what mosasaurs did. They evolved fish-hunting specialists, mollusk-crushing specialists, open ocean pursuit predators, coastal ambush predators, and apex predators that ate everything. But competitive release comes with a hidden cost: reduced resilience. When multiple species fill similar niches, the ecosystem has redundancy. If one species declines, others can expand to fill the gap. But when a single group becomes so dominant that it occupies most of the available niches itself, the entire system becomes vulnerable. If something impacts that dominant group, a disease, a climate shift, a reduction in prey availability, there's no backup. The whole ecosystem can become unstable. This is what may have been happening in the latest Cretaceous. Mosasaurs dominated so thoroughly that they'd become the ocean's only large predatory reptiles. When environmental conditions began shifting, and the late Cretaceous did see significant environmental changes, including volcanic eruptions, sea level fluctuations, and temperature variations, the entire marine reptile ecosystem rested on mosasaur success. And success, as we've seen, can be fragile. But even if mosasaurs were facing challenges before the impact, there's no indication they were facing extinction. The stress markers in their bones suggest difficulties, not catastrophe.
Populations might have been adjusting their ranges, their diets, their hunting strategies. Natural selection would have favored individuals that could adapt to the changing conditions. Given time, they almost certainly would have succeeded. Evolution is remarkably good at solving problems. That's essentially its entire function. The mosasaur lineage had already survived for 34 million years, adapting to countless environmental changes. There's no reason to believe they couldn't have adapted to whatever was happening in the latest Cretaceous. The asteroid didn't catch a dying dynasty in its final gasps. It caught a dynasty that was adjusting, adapting, evolving, doing exactly what successful species do when conditions change. And then conditions changed so drastically, so suddenly, that adaptation became impossible. This brings us to a profound and unsettling realization about extinction. Success doesn't guarantee survival. The mosasaurs did everything right from an evolutionary perspective. They diversified into multiple ecological niches. They spread across global oceans. They evolved sophisticated sensory systems, efficient hunting strategies, and reproductive methods that allowed them to complete their life cycle entirely in water. They reached sizes that made them virtually invulnerable to predation. They dominated their ecosystem more thoroughly than perhaps any predator before or since. And none of it mattered. When the asteroid struck, all that evolutionary success, all those millions of years of refinement and adaptation, became irrelevant. The traits that had made them successful became liabilities. Their large size required too much food. Their specialized hunting strategies didn't work when prey disappeared. Their long generation times meant they couldn't evolve fast enough to keep pace with the collapsing ecosystem. The universe doesn't care about evolutionary success. It doesn't reward the well-adapted or spare the dominant. It operates on physics and probability. And sometimes, those forces align in ways that end even the most successful dynasties. But here's what's truly remarkable. Despite being gone for 66 million years, mosasaurs still influence the modern ocean. This sounds impossible at first. How can extinct animals influence an ecosystem they haven't been part of for over 60 million years? But evolution doesn't work in isolation. Every species that exists today is shaped by the species that came before, including the ones that went extinct. Consider modern sharks. After the mosasaur extinction, sharks expanded into ecological niches that had been closed to them for tens of millions of years. They grew larger. Species like the extinct megalodon, which reached lengths of over 50 feet, were filling roles that mosasaurs once held.
Modern great white sharks, tiger sharks, and bull sharks are all, in a sense, evolutionary responses to an opportunity created by mosasaur extinction. Or consider marine mammals. Whales and dolphins evolved from terrestrial mammals that entered the ocean roughly 50 million years ago, 16 million years after mosasaurs disappeared. But they entered an ocean that had been fundamentally restructured by the extinction event. The ecological niches they evolved to fill were shaped by the absence of mosasaurs as much as by the presence of available resources. If mosasaurs had survived, would whales even exist? Almost certainly not, at least not as the dominant marine predators they became. The ecological space was occupied. The ancestors of whales would have remained coastal animals, unable to compete with established marine reptile dynasties that had millions of years of evolutionary refinement. The modern ocean, with its sharks, whales, and dolphins, is, in a very real sense, built on the absence of mosasaurs. Their extinction created the conditions that allowed mammalian and cartilaginous fish predators to become what they are today.
This is called ecological incumbency, the idea that established species can prevent new species from evolving to fill similar roles, even if the new species might potentially be superior. Mosasaurs were incumbents for 34 million years, and their presence shaped the evolution of every other marine predator during that time. Their absence has been shaping evolution ever since. But there's one more legacy mosasaurs left behind, and it's the one that matters most to us. They're a window into deep time, a reminder that Earth's history is filled with entire worlds we'll never experience. Stand on a beach today and look at the ocean. It seems eternal, unchanging, governed by rhythms, tides, seasons, currents that have operated the same way for as long as humans have existed. But go back 66 million years, and that same ocean would be unrecognizable. Different predators, different prey, different water chemistry, different temperatures, different sounds, the low-frequency booms of mosasaur vocalizations instead of whale songs. Different sights, mosasaurs breaching the surface to breathe instead of dolphins leaping through waves. Go back 150 million years, and it changes again. Ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs dominate, with mosasaurs not yet evolved. Go back 200 million years, and the ichthyosaurs are just beginning their reign, the ocean still recovering from the Permian extinction. Every era had its own ocean, its own cast of characters, its own rules, and each one was as rich, as complex, as fully realized as the ocean we know today. The mosasaurs lived in one of those oceans. They were the apex predators of their world, as perfectly adapted to their time and place as any animal could be. And then their world ended, and ours, eventually, over tens of millions of years, began. This is the nature of deep time. Entire dynasties rise, flourish, and fall. Successful species dominate for millions of years, then vanish. The ecological structures that seem permanent are temporary. The rules that seem inviolable are contingent on conditions that can change. Nothing lasts forever. Not mosasaurs, not dinosaurs, not the current configuration of marine mammals and fish that populate our oceans. Eventually, given enough time, the modern ocean will end too, replaced by something we can't predict, populated by species that haven't evolved yet, governed by ecological relationships that don't currently exist. But in the meantime, we have the fossils, the bones pressed into rock, the trace fossils showing behavior, the chemical signatures revealing metabolism, the tooth marks telling stories of predation and competition and survival. We have enough evidence to reconstruct their world, to understand how they lived and how they died.
We can look at a mosasaur skeleton in a museum and see not just bones, but an entire ecosystem. The prey it hunted, the competitors it faced, the environment it inhabited, the evolutionary pressures that shaped it. And we can ask ourselves, what can mosasaurs teach us about our own survival? Because we live in a time of rapid environmental change, ocean temperatures are rising, chemistry is shifting, food webs are being disrupted. The conditions that have remained relatively stable for the 10,000 years of human civilization are changing faster than they have in millions of years. We're not facing an asteroid impact, at least not yet, but we are facing changes that, while slower, are in some ways just as profound. And the lesson from the mosasaurs is clear. Dominance doesn't protect you from extinction. Success doesn't guarantee survival. Being the apex predator of your ecosystem means nothing if the ecosystem itself collapses. The mosasaurs were magnificent, powerful, perfectly adapted to their world. And when their world changed too quickly, they vanished. We are magnificent, powerful, and remarkably adapted to our world, but we also have something the mosasaurs didn't: awareness. We can see the changes coming. We can measure them, model them, understand them. We have the capacity to alter our behavior in response to future threats, not just past ones. Whether we'll use that capacity remains an open question. But every time we find another mosasaur fossil, every time we learn something new about how they lived and how they died, we're receiving a message from 66 million years in the past. The message is simple: adapt or perish. Not on evolutionary timescales, we don't have that luxury, but on human timescales. Cultural evolution, technological innovation, behavioral change. These are our advantages, the traits that might allow us to survive changes that would doom species relying solely on biological evolution. The mosasaurs couldn't save themselves. They had no conception of asteroids, no understanding of food web collapse, no ability to plan for futures they couldn't predict. We can. Whether we will is the defining question of our time. But that's a story for a different documentary. For now, let's return to the mosasaurs one final time and appreciate them for what they were. Not failures, not evolutionary dead ends, but successful predators that dominated their world for millions of years. They ruled an empire that stretched across every ocean, from pole to pole, from surface to the deepest depths they could reach. They were intelligence and power wrapped in scales, moving through their three-dimensional realm with a grace and efficiency we're still trying to fully understand. They lived. They thrived. They hunted, reproduced, competed, and survived through challenges that would have destroyed lesser species. And when the world ended, they faced extinction with the same magnificent indifference to fate that had characterized their entire existence. They didn't go gentle into that good night. They fought, hunted, survived as long as biology and physics allowed, and then they were gone. The ocean's emperors, the monsters that dinosaurs feared, the reptiles that conquered the sea more completely than any lineage before or since, the mosasaurs. Their reign ended 66 million years ago, but their legacy, preserved in stone, analyzed by science, and inspiring wonder in everyone who encounters their fossils, will endure as long as humans remain curious about the deep history of life on Earth. They deserve to be remembered, not as victims of extinction, but as victors in evolution's endless competition. They won. For 34 million years, they absolutely won. And that's a success story worth telling.